This is the story of one of the most disturbing cases in Harlan County, Kentucky's recorded history. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they happen. The Hargrove family home is still standing today, but not many people are brave enough to go near it. It used to be a proud Victorian farmhouse on the outskirts of Harlan County, Kentucky. Now, in the winter of 1906, it is remembered as a place where reality seemed to fall apart. The weathered clapboard, the sagging porch, and the broken windows like empty eyes are all silent witnesses to events that still don't make sense after all these years. The Harlan County Register, dated the 15th of January 1906, has some strange notes that start the story. A property transfer notice said that Percival Hargrove, a successful coal investor and landowner, had bought a large piece of land about 12 miles northeast of the main town, in the shadow of the Cumberland Mountains. The sale was notable for its size, over 200 acres, and for how quickly the Whitaker family, who had owned the land before, left the area after the sale. Newspaper records show that they left within a week of the sale, saying they did so because they wanted to be in a warmer place. The price was what made this deal so strange. Local records show that Percival Hargrove paid almost twice what the property was worth on the open market. This was seen as a waste of money by the business community in Harlan County. When the editor of the local newspaper asked Hargrove about the purchase, he reportedly only said that some parts of the land were especially valuable to him. It was never made clear what these features were like. The house on the property was already old by 1906 standards. It was built in the 1872, when coal was first discovered in the area. For a house in rural Kentucky, it was very impressive. It had 3 stories, fancy gingerbread trim, a wraparound porch, and a strange octagonal tower room that stuck out above the roofline like a guard. Historians in the area now think that the Whitaker family added the tower in the 1892, but there are no records of building permits being filed. This strange building would later play a big part in the strange things that happened. The Whitakers had only owned the land for 7 years, having bought it from the estate of Josiah Caldwell, one of the first coal prospectors in the area. Caldwell built the main building, but he died before it was finished in 1873. Local records show that the property changed hands 3 times between Caldwell's death and the Whitakers' purchase in 1899. None of the owners who came in between stayed for more than 2 years. This pattern of short ownership might have seemed strange if the economy in the area hadn't been so unstable at the time, with coal fortunes going up and down a lot. What makes this case especially disturbing is not just what happened, but how well it was recorded, only to be lost to history. The Hargrove case occupies a unique historical lacuna. It is too recent to be regarded as mere folklore, yet too remote to have undergone thorough investigation by contemporary standards. The records that do exist are incomplete, contradictory, and in some cases, on purpose hidden. Percival Hargrove was not from Kentucky. According to records, he came from Philadelphia in late 1905 and was already rich from investments in coal mines in Pennsylvania. People who knew him at the time said he was 47 years old and had a serious personality and a lot of education. He brought his wife Cordelia, who was 42, and his younger brother Ambrose, who was 39 and had studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania but never finished his degree. Josephine Winters, Cordelia's 8-year-old unmarried sister, was the 4th person in the house. People at the time said she was delicate but smart. Census records and local stories say that there were no other permanent residents in the house. However, the family did hire a number of local people to work as day laborers, groundskeepers, a cook, and sometimes a driver for their Model T Ford, which was one of the first cars in the county. His leaving the University of Pennsylvania happened at the same time as the university's anatomy department asked for his firing because he was doing experiments that weren't normal and didn't follow established scientific rules. There are no more details, but a letter from one of his professors to the department head, which is kept in the university archives, says that Ambrose was too obsessed with spatial deformities and non-standard anatomical configurations. The University of Pennsylvania's records show that Ambrose Hargrove dropped out of the medical program after finishing 3 years of a 4-year course. It looks like Ambrose traveled a lot in Europe after leaving college, especially in Germany and Austria. Records of immigration show that he came back to the United States in early 1905, just before the family moved to Kentucky. There is no clear record of what he did during these years in Europe, but in letters he wrote later, he mentioned meeting with other researchers with similar interests in Vienna and Prague. The family was friendly with the people in the area, but they didn't fit in very well. They went to the town's Presbyterian church every so often, gave money to good causes in the area, and were known to have dinners for other important families in the area from time to time. Percival was very interested in mining operations in the area and spent a lot of time visiting sites and talking to operators. People started to know Ambrose as someone who took long walks through the woods around his house, supposedly to collect plants. People in the area say that Ambrose was the more outgoing of the two brothers. He would often talk to store owners and farmers for a long time about the history of the area. He seemed to be especially interested in mining accidents and cave systems in the area. There are a lot of natural caves and man-made tunnels on the Cumberland Plateau. Many of them were made during the first mining operations in the 1850 seconds. Samuel Preston, the town librarian, wrote in his journal that Ambrose spent several days in December 1905 going over old maps of the area's underground features and making a lot of notes and sketches. Preston's journal entry from December 14, 1905 has an interesting observation. Mr. A. Hargrove again today, most interested in the Blackwater mine maps and the survey reports from the Caldwell expedition of 1868. His questions are strange. He is less interested in mineral deposits than in the exact angles of tunnel intersections and the direction of the main shafts in relation to surface landmarks. When I asked him what he was researching, he talked about geometric anomalies and non-standard spatial configurations in a way that made it sound like they were very important, though I have to admit I couldn't follow his reasoning. People said that the Hargroves were exactly what they said they were. Rich people from the north who wanted a better life and more opportunities in the Kentucky mountains. Their public behavior didn't show anything strange. That is, until the winter of 1906 came, and it was very bad. The winter of 1906 to 1907 would later be remembered as one of the worst in Kentucky history. For weeks at a time, temperatures dropped well below zero, and from December to February, heavy snowfalls cut off many rural communities. These extreme conditions may have played a role in what happened next, but they don't fully explain it. In late November 1906, several of the day workers didn't show up for work at the Hargrove property without giving a reason. This was the first sign that something might be wrong. In a 1952 interview with Meredith Walker, the daughter of the family's former cook, she said that her mother suddenly refused to go back to the house after almost a year of working there without any problems. When asked to explain, the woman would only say, "The air in that house ain't right, and sounds don't work the way they should there." This strange statement could have been written off as superstition if it hadn't been repeated in different ways by other former employees. There is a letter from Silas Hammond, who worked as a groundskeeper for the Hargroves, to his brother in Tennessee in the Harlan County Historical Society's archives. The letter is dated the 2nd of December 1906. It says, "I won't be going back to the Hargrove place. The pay was fair, but there's something in that tower room that isn't right. Mr. Ambrose spends hours up there, and sometimes I hear him talking when no one else is around. The miss pretends not to notice, but she's changed too. She hardly speaks anymore and just stares out the windows. I have family to think about, and whatever's going on in that house, I don't want any part of it." Hammond's letter goes on to list a number of specific events that made him feel uneasy. One thing was finding Ambrose Hargrove in the garden before dawn and using surveying tools to measure the distance between the house and different points of interest on the property. When Hammond got close, Ambrose looked surprised and quickly packed up his tools, saying he was just checking angles. Hammond said that the stakes Ambrose had put in the ground made a pattern that made no sense for any kind of building or planting I ever heard of. Hammond also talked about an event that happened with Cordelia Hargrove. He wrote, "I found Mrs. H. standing in the upstairs hallway staring at the wall for almost an hour without moving. When I asked if she needed anything, she turned slowly and looked at me as if from a great distance. 'The wall isn't there, Mr. Hammond. Can't you see?' Then she just walked away. trailing her fingers along the wall she'd just said wasn't there. It gave me the coldest feeling I ever had. By the middle of December, the Hargrove family had pretty much cut themselves off from the outside world. Deliveries were left at the gate of the property, and Percival and Cordelia had not been seen in town for a few weeks. People sometimes saw Ambrose driving alone in the family car to the county records office or the small local library for short visits. The librarian's log shows that his reading interests had changed a lot, going from books about plants to strange religious texts and historical accounts of local mining accidents. The Blackwater mine collapse of 1879 was one mining event that seemed to really interest Ambrose. The newspaper archives say that 7 miners were stuck when a part of the mine flooded without warning. The strange shape of the tunnels made it harder for rescuers to get to the trapped men. One rescuer said, "More like a maze than proper mining shafts." When rescuers finally got to them 5 days later, they found something they couldn't explain. The miners used the last of their tools to carve intricate geometric shapes into the walls of the room where they were stuck. None of the men lived, and the official cause of death was asphyxiation. However, the medical examiner's notes, which Ambrose is said to have copied by hand, showed that the tissues were unusually dry, which is not what happens when someone drowns or suffocates. The location of the mine itself is what makes the Blackwater incident so important to the Hargrove case. The Hargroves would later buy the land where it was located. One of its main shafts was almost directly below where the house's tower room stood. This connection doesn't seem like it could be a coincidence, since Ambrose was so interested in the mine's history. Ambrose is said to have read a lot of Josiah Caldwell's journal, which was written by the original owner who started building the house in the early 1872. The County Historical Society keeps this journal, which has a number of disturbing entries from the months leading up to Caldwell's death. One letter from March 1873 says, "The anomaly in the north shaft persists. When approached from the eastern tunnel, the chamber appears considerably larger than when accessed from the west. I have verified this discrepancy with multiple measurements, yet can find no rational explanation. The miners refuse to work in this section, claiming that tools left there are not where they were placed when one returns." The next entry, from April 1873, is even more worrying. "I have begun building the observation room on top of the house, right above the strange chamber. My calculations suggest that the strange properties of the space below may be affected, maybe even directed by proper geometric alignment from above. The workers think I'm crazy for insisting on the octagonal design, but the angles must be exact for the job." Caldwell's last entry, dated the 15th of June, 1873, says, "The alignment is complete. Tonight I will try the first observation." The next morning, he was found dead in the partially finished tower room, apparently from a brain hemorrhage. The house's construction was put on hold for a while, but later owners finished it. The tower's original octagonal shape was kept, though. It's not clear if Ambrose Hargrove knew all of these historical details before buying the property, but what he did after that makes it seem like he knew at least some of the site's strange history. By December 1906, the family had definitely started making big changes to the house, especially to the tower room. A delivery receipt from a hardware store in Harlan, dated December 10th, 1906, lists materials ordered by Percival Hargrove, including unusual quantities of copper wire, glass plates, and specialized surveying equipment. The store owner later remembered that Percival had also asked about getting some minerals and metal alloys that aren't usually used in construction or decoration. However, these items were not included in the order. Kentucky had a very bad winter, from 1906 to 1907. In late December, a lot of snow fell, cutting off many rural properties, including the Hargrove estate, for almost 2 weeks. Percival Hargrove came to town for the first time in over a month when the roads finally cleared in early January. Ezekiel Holloway, the owner of the general store, wrote in his journal about Mr. Hargrove's visit. "He came in today looking 10 years older than when I last saw him. He bought a lot of kerosene, salt, and candles. When I asked how Mrs. Hargrove was doing, he stared at me for almost half a minute before saying that she was transitioning well. I thought it was strange how he said it. When he left, I noticed that he had forgotten his gloves, which showed strange markings on his wrists that looked like burns or brands. Holloway's journal gives more information than later official accounts. The markings on Hargrove's wrists were like nothing I've ever seen. Not random burns, but precise patterns, almost like writing in some foreign script. When I called his attention to his forgotten gloves, he seemed alarmed that his wrists were exposed and quickly covered them, though not before I noticed that the patterns seemed to shift slightly as I looked at them, as if the skin itself were unstable. His eyes, too, were changed. The irises less clearly defined than I recalled. The boundaries between color and white somehow blurred. When he thanked me, his voice had a quality that made my skin crawl, as if each word were being formed by something that had only recently learned how speech should sound. This journal entry is the last time anyone saw a member of the Hargrove family in public. The subsequent events are chiefly recorded through the escalating apprehensions of neighbors and ultimately local authorities. A farmer who lived nearby said he saw strange lights in the Hargrove house's tower room late at night on the 17th of January 1907. The lights weren't steady like lamps. They flashed in a way that reminded him of heat lightning. That same night, people in the nearest town said they heard a sound like the mountain opening up, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the Hargrove property. One witness, Margaret Donovan, whose farm was closest to the Hargrove land, provided a more detailed account in a letter to her sister in Louisville. It began just after midnight, a humming that seemed to come from the ground itself, growing steadily louder until the windows rattled. Then came the light, not from the house at first, but from the ground around it, a pale blue glow that rose like mist, gathering most densely around the tower. The dogs wouldn't stop howling, and the horses in the barn were in such a state that I feared they might injure themselves. The light and sound continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then ceased abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard what sounded like voices calling from a great distance, though I could not make out any words. I did not sleep the rest of that night, and at first light, I noticed that the pattern of snow on the ground between our property and the Hargroves had changed. No longer smooth drifts, but arranged in circular patterns that no wind I know could create. Ezekiel Powell, the sheriff of the county, didn't believe these reports at first. There were a lot of winter storms, and people often reported strange weather effects in the mountains. But when the same things kept happening for 3 nights in a row, and witnesses said they saw a column of mist rising from the property that could be seen from miles away, Powell finally agreed to look into it. The official report of Sheriff Powell's visit to the Hargrove estate on the 21st of January 1907 is probably the most upsetting thing in this whole case. Powell had been a police officer for 20 years and was known for being sober and reporting the facts without embellishment. The fact that a man like this would write the story that follows makes it even more important. Powell's report says that he got to the property in the early afternoon and found the gate open, but the long drive was still covered in snow. He walked to the main house and saw that none of the chimneys were smoking, even though it was very cold. He knocked on the front door, but no one answered. This was strange for a rural property at the time, since the door was unlocked. Powell walked into the house and called out to let everyone know he was there. Here is a direct quote from his report. The inside of the house was cold enough that I could see my breath, but the air had an unusual quality to it, dense and somehow resistant, as if I were moving through something more substantial than just atmosphere. The main floor looked undisturbed, but a fine layer of what looked like coal dust covered many surfaces. I saw that all the mirrors in the house had been covered with cloth, and that many candles had been placed around the house, but none were lit at the time of my inspection. As Powell went deeper into the house, he saw that the walls of the central hallway had strange patterns on them. These weren't random acts of vandalism. They were precise geometric shapes made with what looked like charcoal. He said they were like surveyor's notes, but they didn't match up with any mapping system I know of. Powell's report goes on to say, "When I got to the central staircase, I heard what sounded like rhythmic movement from the upper floors. I announced my presence again and began to climb. With each step, the strange quality of the air became more pronounced, and I felt unusually disoriented, as if the staircase were somehow longer than its physical dimensions would allow. After what seemed like an excessive number of steps, I reached the second-floor landing. The family's private rooms were on the second floor of the house. Powell said that the master bedroom was in a peculiar order. The bed was perfectly made and personal items were arranged with unnatural precision. However, the walls had the same charcoal markings as the hallway below, but they were more elaborate and covered almost every available surface. Powell later told his deputy about a strange object he found on the bedside table that wasn't in the official report. It was a glass jar with something that looked like a model of the house inside it, made of a dark material. The model was perfect in every way, even the octagonal tower, but when Powell tried to look at it more closely, he noticed that the perspective seemed to change depending on the angle from which it was viewed, as if the proportions of the model were somehow unstable. Powell said that the other bedrooms looked mostly undisturbed, but one, which he thought belonged to Josephine Winters, had a strange arrangement of personal items in the middle of the floor. A small box that looked like it had dirt in it was surrounded by hairbrushes, jewelry, and letters in a perfect circle. Powell's description of the narrow stairs that led to the third floor in the tower room was the most upsetting. The steps to the upper level were marked with many candle drippings and what looked like footprints made from the same coal dust that filled the house. The footprints had an unusual feature. They went up the stairs but never came back down, as if those who went up never came back. It was even more troubling that the footprints seemed to change shape as they went up, starting out as normal human prints but getting longer and narrower toward the top, with an unusual space between the impression of heel and toe. Researchers have looked closely at Powell's description of the tower room itself. He said, "The octagonal room at the top of the house made no sense. The ceiling seemed unusually far away, and the windows, which looked like they were the right size from the outside, looked long and narrow from the inside, letting in light at angles that seemed impossible." Powell said that the room was filled with a complicated arrangement of items that made a pattern on the floor. These included geological specimens, botanical samples preserved in jars, surveying equipment, and many papers with handwritten notes on them. A big map of the area was in the middle of this setup. Powell said that the corners were held down by strange metal objects that looked like mining tools but were made of strange materials and had strange shapes. Powell later said in an interview that what he said about the tower room didn't do a good job of describing what he actually saw. It wasn't very big, maybe 12 feet across, but it gave the impression of a lot of depth, as if the walls went much further than the house itself could allow. He said, "The room was wrong in ways I can't explain. It was like the normal rules of space didn't apply there. I could see all 8 walls at once, no matter where I stood, which I know is impossible. And there was a feeling of movement, even though nothing moved. A feeling that the room was slowly rotating around an axis I couldn't quite see." The most troubling part of Powell's report is what he found in the northwest corner of the tower room, a desk with Ambrose Hargrove's journal on it. Powell included some parts of this journal in his report, but he said that most of the writing was either in code or too technical for him to understand. The parts that could be read talked about how Ambrose seemed to be obsessed with the area's strange geology, especially the network of caves and abandoned mine shafts that run through the mountains. One passage, dated December 30th, 1906, says, "P is still not sure, but the evidence is clear. The way the underlying strata are arranged is not natural. The symmetry is too perfect, and the points where they meet are too perfectly aligned with astronomical markers. This was planned, and what we thought were random tunnels are actually a form of notation, a message, or a map. C has started to hear it too, the resonance from below. She calls it voices, but I hear it as a single voice, speaking in a language that doesn't go through the ears." Another entry from the 5th of January 1907 gives more specific information. The Blackwater incident of 2079 was a partial activation. The miners unintentionally caused a localized shift by blasting, which opened a temporary hole. Their carvings were not random. They were an unconscious attempt to stabilize the breach. Caldwell knew this, which is why he built the tower as a focusing mechanism. His mistake was trying to observe alone, without properly preparing the physical vessel. We will not make the same mistake. A later entry from January 14th, 1907 is more broken up. The passage is opening. We've taken out the stuff that was blocking the north shaft. and the effect was immediate. The air itself seems to thin at certain times, becoming permeable. Jay passed her hand through the western wall yesterday, up to the wrist, with no apparent harm. We are proceeding with the final preparations. P has marked the walls according to the pattern. The tower alignment is now perfect. The last entry, from January 20th, just one day before Powell's investigation, says, "We have been invited. The way is prepared. What was solid is now permeable. What was fixed is now fluid. The hours of transition have been calculated. We go together, leaving nothing behind." At the end of Powell's report, he says that he couldn't find any signs of the Hargrove family or Josephine Winters on the property. There was almost 2 feet of undisturbed snow around the house, but there were no footprints leading away from it and no signs that they had left by car. The family's car was still in the carriage house, but it was only partially put together. Powell said that the parts were arranged in a way that looked like the patterns that were marked all over the house. Powell's description of leaving the property was the most disturbing. As I descended from the tower room, I experienced an unsettling phenomenon. The staircase, which had seemed unusually long during my ascent, now seemed impossibly short. I reached the ground floor after what seemed like merely 3 or 4 steps, though I know the house to be 3 full stories in height. Upon exiting the house, I turned to look back at the structure and experienced momentary disorientation, as the building appeared to be simultaneously farther away than it should have been and at an angle inconsistent with my position on the drive. Most troublingly, I observed what appeared to be a light in the tower room, though I had left no lamps burning anywhere in the house. Powell wrote more about what happened in his personal journal than what he wrote in his official report. He wrote, "I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whole time I was in that house, not by human eyes, but by something else. Something that saw me from angles or distances I can't understand. The air in the tower room seemed to pulse with a kind of awareness, and when I put my hand on the wall, I felt what seemed like movement beneath the surface, as if the wall itself were breathing." I don't want to talk about these feelings because I'm afraid they'll make me seem unreliable, but I can't just dismiss them as fantasy. Something happened in that house that I don't understand, but that doesn't make it any less real. At best, the official investigation that came after Powell's report was half-hearted. The case was called an unexplained disappearance because there was no proof of violence or a fight. Some people thought the family had left the area for unknown reasons, while others thought they had gotten lost in the caves under the property while exploring. There were no bodies found, and after January 1907, there was no record of any Hargrove family member in any official record. The property stayed empty, and it was hard to tell who owned it because there were no heirs or a will. People in the area stayed away from the house, and rumors started to spread about strange things that happened there, like time seeming to move differently near the house, strange lights in the tower room during certain phases of the moon, and the sound of voices speaking in a language that no one could understand. A group of teens from the area went into the house on a dare in 1919. 4 of the 5 came out. Even though a lot of people looked for him, they never found Micah Holloway, the one 7-year-old boy who went missing. The other teens told different stories about what happened. 2 said that Micah had just gone into another room and never come back, while the other 2 said that they had all been in the tower room together when Micah touched one of the walls and just wasn't there anymore. The investigation was eventually dropped because there was no evidence of foul play. Clayton Reeves, one of the teens who survived, went on to become a well-known doctor in the county. He gave an interview to a local historian in 1952, just before he died, in which he talked more about the 1919 event. He said, "We were foolish boys, drawn by the tales of the haunted house. We brought candles and a bottle of whiskey stolen from my father's cabinet. The house was as described in the stories, the strange markings on the walls, the impossible angles of the tower room. Micah was the boldest of us and had consumed more of the whiskey than the rest. He began tracing the markings on the wall with his finger, mockingly reciting what he claimed were incantations. We laughed, but then the air in the room changed, became thick and somehow charged, as if before a lightning strike. The markings beneath Micah's finger began to glow with a pale blue light. He turned to us with an expression of surprise rather than fear and said, 'I can see through it now. Then, he pressed his hand against the wall, and it yielded. There is no other way to describe it. His hand passed through the solid wall as if it were merely a projection or illusion. Before any of us could move or speak, he stepped forward, entirely into the wall, and was gone. We heard his voice once more, from a seemingly impossible distance, saying only, "It's beautiful here." Then silence. We fled in terror, and I have never returned to that place, though it haunts my dreams still. Harrison Winslow, a historian and folklorist from the University of Kentucky, became interested in the Hargrove case in 1932 when the Great Depression was at its worst. He was looking into the history of coal mining in the area. Winslow spent a few months gathering stories from people in the area and looking at what official records were still available. Most importantly, he found some of Ambrose Hargrove's earlier letters to geological societies in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. These letters, written in 1905 before the family moved to Kentucky, show how Ambrose became more and more interested in what he called non-Euclidean structures in the Appalachian cave systems. In a letter to the American Geological Society, he said, "The conventional understanding of these formations as the result of water erosion over millennia is fundamentally inadequate. The patterns I have documented in the eastern Kentucky systems suggest deliberate design, not by human hands certainly, but by some process or intelligence that manipulates three-dimensional space according to principles we have yet to fully comprehend." It seems that this letter was seen as the work of a strange amateur. But Winslow found out that Ambrose had kept doing research on his own, writing to a number of little-known European academics who were interested in what they called alternative dimensional mathematics. These conversations got more and more strange until they stopped completely when the family moved to Kentucky. One letter that Winslow found that was especially interesting was a letter between Ambrose and a mathematician at the University of Vienna named Heinrich Schaefer. Schaefer wrote in his letter, "Your observations about the strange angles in the cave formations are very troubling. If your measurements are correct, these structures can't exist in normal Euclidean space. I would advise you to be careful as you continue your explorations. There are mathematical theorists who have suggested that under certain conditions, the barriers between what we see as three-dimensional space and other spatial configurations might become permeable. The consequences of such permeability are very serious and possibly dangerous." Winslow's investigation came to an end with a trip to the empty Hargrove property in October 1932. Winslow brought cameras and made detailed notes of what he saw, which is different from what Sheriff Powell did 25 years earlier. His pictures, which are kept in the University of Kentucky archives, show a house that is falling apart. The roof is partially collapsed, the porch is sagging, and the windows are broken. The tower room, on the other hand, looked pretty much the same, with its octagonal shape still clearly visible against the sky. Winslow's notes from this visit say that he felt very uneasy when he first walked into the property. The house is in a strange kind of isolation. Even though you can see it from the road, it seems to get farther away as you get closer, taking longer to get to than the distance would suggest. The air around the building has a quality I can only describe as resistant, as if you were moving through a medium denser than air. Inside, Winslow found that the inside was mostly, as Powell had said, but it was now very damaged from being outside. There were still some places where the charcoal marks on the walls could be seen, and Winslow drew pictures of some of the more complicated patterns. He said they looked a lot like some kinds of mining notes, and also like astronomical charts that show how stars move. But the tower room had changed in one important way. Winslow wrote, "The floor of the octagonal chamber now has a circular depression about 6 feet in diameter, as if the boards had been pushed down very hard. The depression is geometrically perfect, not the result of structural collapse, but rather a deliberate reconfiguration of the physical space. Standing at the edge of this depression, I felt a deep sense of vertigo and the unsettling feeling that I was looking not down at the floor, but out into a vast distance." Winslow was in the house for a few hours, taking pictures and measurements. He said that as the sun began to set, he became more and more confused. "Time seems to work differently in these walls. My watch says I've been here for less than 3 hours. But the quality of my experience suggests a much longer time." He also said that he heard a resonant tone coming from the circular depression in the tower room. It wasn't audible in the usual way, but he felt it as a vibration in the bones of his skull. He also said that he sometimes saw distortions in his field of vision, as if parts of the house were changing shape when he looked at them from the side. In a very disturbing part, Winslow wrote, "I set my camera on the tripod to take a picture of the circular depression in the floor. Sounds also act strangely. Sometimes my footsteps come before the physical act of taking a step, and my voice seems to reach my ears before I have finished speaking." As night fell, Winslow's notes grew more fragmented and disturbed. Upon developing the plate, I found not the depression, but what appears to be an opening into a vast space, filled with geometric structures unlike anything in our architectural tradition. Angles that connect in impossible ways. Curves that return to their starting points, despite maintaining a consistent direction. Most troublingly, there appears to be movement among these structures' forms that shift and flow with a purpose that suggests consciousness. This picture, which would have been the best proof that the tower room was strange, is not one of the ones that the university has kept. It is not clear if it was taken out on purpose or just lost over time. There is a part of Winslow's last notes, which he wrote by flashlight as he was getting ready to leave, that has become very important to later research on the case. "I now understand what Ambrose Hargrove found. This house is at the crossroads of normal space and something else. It's not another dimension like we usually think of it. It's a different set of spatial properties. The tower room acts like a lens or aperture, focusing and concentrating whatever is on the other side of this intersection. The geometric markings all over the house are not symbols. They are a type of mathematical notation that, when set up correctly, lets the barrier between these spatial domains get thinner." Winslow left the property soon after writing these notes. He went back to Lexington and started getting his research ready for publication right away. But just 3 weeks later, while he was working late in his university office, he had what was officially recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage. This happened before his work could be published. It was said that his research materials were collected and kept in the university archives, but when other researchers tried to find them in the 1,950 seconds, they could only find the photos and a small part of his notes. The story of the night watchman who found Winslow's body is especially disturbing. The watchman said that Winslow was found sitting at his desk with a look of deep horror on his face. It was said that there were charcoal drawings on the walls of his office that looked like the ones in the Hargrove house. The room also smelled strongly of burned metal. The watchman said that Winslow's body was unnaturally stiff and that his skin was see-through, which was not included in the official report. The Hargrove property kept getting worse over the next few decades. In 1948, a fire that no one knows how it started destroyed most of the main building. However, the tower room stayed mostly intact. In 1952, the county took the land for unpaid taxes, but no one ever tried to build on it. The ruins were slowly forgotten by everyone except the people who lived nearby, who still stayed away from the area. As part of a plan to widen a road, a surveying team from the Kentucky Highway Department looked at the property for a short time in 1954. Their report talks about strange magnetic anomalies near the tower ruins and strange differences in distance measurements depending on which way the property was approached. The project engineer suggested changing the planned road to avoid the area altogether because the ground was unstable, even though no geological testing had been done during this survey. Robert Carson, one of the team members, is said to have left the group and been found 2 hours later in a state of extreme disorientation. His co-workers said that Carson was found standing in the middle of the tower ruins, looking up at what looked like empty air. When people called his name, he didn't respond and didn't seem to know who his teammates were. Carson slowly got back to normal after being forcibly taken off the site, but he said he didn't remember what happened. He quit the highway department the next week and is said to have left the state for good. Dr. Vivian Marsh, a physicist from MIT who was interested in folklore about strange spatial phenomena, did the last known investigation into the Hargrove case in 1967. Dr. Marsh found references to the Hargrove house in Harrison Winslow's surviving notes and was interested in the geometric patterns that Winslow had written down. Marsh went to the site in June 1967 and found only the foundations and some of the tower structure. She wrote in her journal, "The octagonal foundation of the tower room is still in perfect condition after 60 years of being outside." The stone shows no signs of weathering or moss growth, unlike the rest of the ruins. Most interestingly, accurate surveying shows that the octagon's interior dimensions are mathematically impossible. The internal area is bigger than what the external perimeter should contain. Marsh's investigation centered on this spatial anomaly that seemed impossible. She used cutting-edge measuring tools for the time to record a consistent difference of about 4.7 feet between the outside and inside dimensions of the octagonal foundation. She wrote in her notes, "This difference can't be explained by any standard architectural or mathematical rule. The space inside the octagon is literally bigger than the space it takes up, which is a physical impossibility that keeps happening when you measure it over and over." Marsh's study used more technology than studies done before. She brought a lot of different tools with her, such as magnetometers, radiation detectors, and early ultrasonic mapping tools. Her readings showed several strange things. Magnetic field fluctuations that followed a regular pattern instead of the random changes that happen in nature. Unexplained temperature gradients within the octagonal foundation, with the center always being several degrees cooler than the outside, no matter what the weather was like. And most interestingly, ultrasonic reflections that made it look like there were solid structures where there weren't any. Marsh wrote in her journal, "The ultrasonic mapping produces results consistent with a complex geometric structure, extending both above and below the visible foundation remains, as if we are seeing the echo of a building that exists in some state of partial manifestation. The pattern changes subtly over time, suggesting movement or reconfiguration. This is not consistent with any known physical phenomenon and cannot be dismissed as equipment malfunction, as repeated calibrations show the instruments are functioning correctly." For 3 days, Marsh took different measurements and tests at the site. On the last day, she set up gear to record audio and electromagnetic fields in the area. The recordings, which are kept in MIT's archives, show what acoustics experts call an unusual harmonic pattern that doesn't match any known natural or artificial source. A part of the recording made shortly after midnight on June 17th was even more disturbing. It sounds like people are talking to each other, but they aren't speaking in any language that can be understood. Marsh wrote in her last report, "The phenomenon at the Hargrove site seems to be dormant rather than resolved. The mathematical inconsistencies in the physical space are still measurable, which suggests that whatever Ambrose Hargrove found or activated is still having an effect. The site is an ongoing anomaly in conventional spatial physics, a place where our normal understanding of three-dimensional space is not enough." Marsh suggested that a team of experts from different fields look into the issue more, but her request for funding was turned down, so she had to give up on the project. In a private letter to a coworker from September 1967, she wrote, "I find myself increasingly preoccupied with the geometric patterns documented at the site. They appear in my dreams, and, occasionally, disturbingly, in my waking perception as well, overlaid upon ordinary objects when I am fatigued. I have begun to understand them not as symbols, but as operators, functional notations that modify the behavior of space itself." In early 1968, Marsh took a break from MIT because of health problems. University records show that she planned to spend 6 months recovering in northern Vermont. She never came back, and there is no record of her after March 1968. A brief investigation into her disappearance was conducted, but with no evidence of foul play and Marsh being an adult with no close family, the case was eventually closed. There is one last disturbing thing about Dr. Marsh's disappearance. When coworkers went to her office to pack up her things, they saw that her desk was covered in very detailed geometric drawings that looked a lot like the ones found in the Hargrove house. Most importantly, they found a journal entry from the day before she left MIT that said, "The angles are wrong here. Everything we see as straight is actually curved toward a point we can't see. I understand now why they left. They weren't escaping. They were coming back." The Hargrove property is now private land, with a fence around it and signs telling people not to go there. The forest has mostly taken over the ruins, but people who live nearby say that plants grow in strange ways around the tower room, making perfect circles and geometric patterns that change with the seasons. They also talk about strange things happening to electronics nearby, like compass needles that spin without stopping, watches that run at strange speeds, and cell phones that record calls made at strange times. The reports from the few hikers who have gotten close to the site in the last few years are probably the most troubling. They talk about a confusing effect where distances seem to change in size without warning, and a constant feeling that something is visible just out of the corner of their eye, like a structure or opening that disappears when they look at it directly. Several have reported hearing what sounds like distant voices engaged in animated conversation, speaking what one hiker described as English with all the consonants in the wrong places. Marianne Chambers, a geology graduate student at the University of Louisville, became interested in the Hargrove case in 2002 after finding references to it in Harrison Winslow's old papers. Even though locals told her not to, she camped near the ruins for several days, taking soil samples and pictures. During this time, her academic advisor said she got a series of increasingly strange emails from her. These emails talked about patterns in the landscape that change when they aren't directly observed and strange sounds that seem to come from below the ground. Chambers' field journal, which was found after she went missing, has a number of troubling notes in it. One entry says, "The geometric inconsistencies go beyond the tower foundation. When I map the whole property, I find that the distances between fixed points change depending on the time of day and the direction of measurement. For example, a straight line walked from the north gate to the ruins is 437 meters long at dawn, but only 392 meters long at dusk. This change is consistent and can be repeated, so measurement error is not possible." Another entry talks about how she found what looked like an entrance to the old mine workings. Located the collapsed shaft entrance about 200 meters northwest of the house foundation. "The opening is barely big enough for a person to fit through, but my equipment detects a large open space beyond. Most interestingly, the shaft seems to move overnight. Every morning I have to search for it again, even though I carefully mark its location every night. It's as if the entrance is slowly moving through the substrate, following some pattern I can't yet figure out." Chambers' last email, which was sent at 3:17 a.m. On her third night at the site, she got a message that said, "The tower still exists. It's just oriented along a different axis. Now I can see where they went. It was just a series of coordinates." The next day, people said she was missing because she didn't come back to Louisville as planned. They searched her campsite and found her gear neatly arranged in a geometric pattern, but they couldn't find Chambers herself. The case is still open, but no one has ever found her. The last picture found on Chambers' digital camera is what makes her disappearance so scary. The picture shows what looks like the inside of a mine shaft lit up by her flashlight, but the shaft doesn't go up or down like it should. It doesn't seem to open into a cave. Instead, it opens into a huge space full of angular structures that don't look like natural rock formations. There seems to be a person standing with their back to the camera in one corner of the picture, where the shadow is partially covering them. Experts who study images have not been able to figure out if this is Chambers herself, reflected in some way, someone else, or just a pattern in the rock that makes a pareidolia effect. We still don't know what happened to the Hargrove family. There were no bodies found, no signs of violence, and no official records of their existence after January 1907. They just disappeared, leaving behind a house with strange shapes and walls covered in equations that no mathematician has been able to fully figure out. What did Ambrose Hargrove find in the caves that are under his land? What change did Sheriff Powell see happening but not realize? Who sent the family an invitation? And what was it for? There has never been a good answer to these questions. Today, most academics agree that the Hargrove case is a strange mix of factors. Being alone, being in the winter, possibly being poisoned by carbon monoxide from bad ventilation, and maybe even shared mental illness or even planned fraud. This theory says that the family probably died while exploring the cave systems under the property. Their bodies were never found because these underground networks are so big and mostly uncharted. However, this explanation does not take into account the strange mathematical problems that have been found at the site or the strange things that have been seen by many different people over the years. It doesn't explain why the foundation of the tower room is perfectly preserved, why there are electromagnetic anomalies, or why people keep reporting spatial distortion. A group from a well-known paranormal investigation TV show tried to film at the site in 2009. Most importantly, their audio recordings picked up what sound engineers have called multiple layers of sound occurring simultaneously, as if the recording device were picking up sound from several places at once. Later, The show's producer said that 3 of the 6 crew members had serious trouble figuring out where they were on the property. One camera operator got so lost that he couldn't find the way out, even though it was clearly visible from where he was standing. Their equipment kept breaking down, and the footage they got only had short, distorted parts. Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, a theoretical physicist who visited the site in 2015 while writing a book about spatial anomalies, gave the most convincing recent testimony. He wrote in an obscure journal of fringe science that the Hargrove property represents what might be termed a soft spot in conventional 3-dimensional space, a location where the normal rules of Euclidean geometry become flexible. This is not supernatural, but rather represents a manifestation of principles well established in theoretical physics, though rarely observed in macroscopic settings. What the Hargroves appear to have discovered was a method of exploiting this spatial flexibility, of opening what might be described as a doorway to a different spatial configuration. Pritchard then says that the geometric markings all over the house were a kind of mathematical language that was meant to change this spatial flexibility. He writes, "Just as certain sound frequencies can break glass by creating resonance, these specific geometric arrangements created a type of resonance with the underlying structure of space itself, allowing for what could be called phase shifting between different spatial configurations." Pritchard's theory has very important effects. If the Hargroves really did find a way to move between different spatial configurations, where did they go? And even more scary, could other people do the same thing? It seems that Pritchard doesn't want to go too far down this path of inquiry. When his book finally came out, it only briefly mentioned the Hargrove case, and he has turned down all requests for interviews about it. In a private email to a coworker that was made public through a Freedom of Information request, Pritchard said, "I have decided to limit my discussion of the Hargrove case in the final manuscript. During my night at the site, I experienced phenomena that I cannot explain within my current understanding of physics, phenomena that have continued to affect me in the months since my visit. I find myself drawing the same geometric patterns repeatedly, often without conscious intention. Last week I woke to find my office walls covered with equations I had apparently written during the night, though I have no memory of doing so. I believe it would be irresponsible to publish detailed information about these patterns or the site's location, as I am increasingly convinced that they represent a genuine hazard to those who study them too closely." Harrison Winslow's last words, written the night before he died suddenly, may have been the most accurate. What we think of as solid and unchangeable, the very fabric of space itself, is actually conditional, a consensus reality that can be negotiated under certain circumstances and with the right understanding. The Hargroves did not disappear in the way we usually think of it. They simply stepped sideways into a spatial configuration where our physical laws and dimensions no longer apply. They turned the tower room into a doorway and then walked through it into whatever lies beyond. If you want to visit the site yourself, be careful. Local police strictly enforce trespassing laws in the area, and the property is still private. But the last paragraph of Sheriff Powell's original report, which is often left out of official copies but is kept in his personal journal, may be the most important warning. I would advise that the property be demolished and the land reclaimed by the county, though I recognize the legal impediments to such action in the absence of clear inheritance. What exists in that house is not something that should remain accessible. Some doors, once opened, cannot be properly closed again, and what lies on the other side may continue to take an interest in those who examine the threshold too closely. The Hargrove house is no longer there, but the door they opened is still there, waiting in the woods of Kentucky. Its edges have softened over time, but its purpose has not changed. It is a monument to a family that found a way to step outside of normal reality, whether on purpose or by accident. They left behind only equations on walls, footprints that changed as they climbed, and a legacy of warped space that still calls out to those who know how to listen. It's most disturbing to think that the Hargroves didn't find anything new, but rather something old that was waiting for them. Something that has always been there in the spaces between what we think of as solid and unchanging. Something still exists there, and it sometimes affects our world through the opening they help to make bigger. A hiker who had gone off the beaten path in 2018 said he saw what he called a house that wasn't there. He said he saw through the trees what looked like a Victorian house with an odd octagonal tower. But when he tried to get closer, the building seemed to move away from him, staying the same distance no matter how far he walked. He tried several times to get to the structure, but finally gave up and headed back to the trail. What should have been a 10-minute walk took almost 3 hours. They checked his GPS device and saw that it had recorded him walking in a perfect octagon, even though he said he was going straight toward the house. Gregory Parsons, the hiker, told local authorities about something else that wasn't in the official report. He said that while he was trying to get to the fake house, he saw something move at one of the tower windows for a short time. It looked like a person was watching him. He said the figure was wearing clothes from the early 20th century, but its features seemed to change all the time, like the face was always moving around. The report left out this detail, but the officer who responded said Parsons looked very upset and might have been dehydrated. Historians in the area say that the Hargrove case isn't the only one like it. There are reports of similar spatial anomalies all over the Cumberland Plateau, often linked to abandoned mines or natural cave systems. Some scientists think that the whole area is built on a web of thin places, which are places where the normal structure of space becomes more flexible. It is not clear if the Hargroves chose this place on purpose or if they just happened to find it. What we do know is that 4 people went into that house in the winter of 1906 and never came out. Still, something is moving in those ruins, something that sees just beyond the edge of what most people can see, waiting for others who might notice the patterns and figure out what they mean. The next time you feel like you're in a place where things don't seem quite right, where time moves strangely, or where sounds reach your ears too soon, think about the fact that you might be at the edge of another threshold. And be very careful about what shapes you let your eyes follow on the walls around you. For the Hargroves, that threshold led to somewhere, and whatever is on the other side may still be watching and waiting for someone else to figure out the puzzle and open the door again.